Correction officers of Reddit, have you ever met an inmate that was actually a very nice person but did absolutely horrifying crimes? If so, what's their story? Corrections nurse here. Never interacted with this inmate. I just see him out on the yard as I come into work. He collects bread crusts and I always see him feeding the birds. And the birds trust him and fly straight to his hand to eat. He looks like a nice enough guy from a distance. And birds only land on the hands of Disney princesses, right? Well, one day I caught him in a moment. A particularly fat pigeon landed on his hand and bent down to eat. He closed his fist on the pigeon's head and flicked his wrist to snap its neck. Its body was still flailing as he calmly put it into his pocket and then put out his hand again to feed more birds. I was told he was going to cook and eat it, which made me feel a little better, but still. And that's what comes to my mind every time an inmate is nice to me. My dad worked as a doctor in a prison for a short time. Came back with lots of stories of the inmates. He said he talked to one guy who was always friendly and chill. Found out the guy had a life sentence and asked the guy why he was in prison. The guy said he had a bad lawyer. My dad looked up his information later on and it turned out he had murdered his own daughter. So yay. Never judge a book by its cover. Former CO here. I had 2 guys in my unit that strangled their newborns when they wouldn't stop crying. One of them was drinking and trying to watch a hockey game. His daughter wouldn't stop crying. He got annoyed, walked over and just choked her until she stopped. The other guy's story was somewhat similar, but I can't remember the details. They were both porters in that housing unit. They were doing a lot of time. Can't remember exactly how much they were given. One guy was already at year 16. Probably 2 of the nicest guys I met while on the job. They didn't come off as crazy degenerates and seemed like genuinely nice guys. I used to stand in the day room and have some interesting convos with them and their little crew they called the trailer trash circle or something to that effect. I tutored in juvie. One of the boys had murdered 3 people for a gang initiation and when asked, had absolutely no remorse for it. He was a very nice, polite, and intelligent kid though who would draw me little pictures and always tried extra hard on his creative writing assignments. Had a very good sense of humor too and often made everyone in the room laugh and smile. I honestly had trouble reminding myself that he was a cold-blooded murderer. Not a CO. RN here. I've taken care of a fair amount of detained prisoners that have been admitted to the hospital. I usually ask them what got them locked up cause I'm nosy. I had one super pleasant middle-aged guy tell me his story. Apparently he and his wife were going through or had gone through an ugly split. They were already separated when someone broke into his house with a weapon intending to hurt him. He wound up killing the guy in self-defense. I assume he had a gun or something, but not before he found out his wife had arranged it. She hired a hitman to come kill him. But instead of going to the police after, he went to his wife's place and killed her outright. Super friendly guy though. No idea how much of that was true, but that's definitely the craziest story I've heard from an inmate. Not a company. Took a class in a prison. It was half college students, half inmates. Our TA was in for 25 to life. He was an amazingly smart and nice person. His crime? He killed the guy that raped his sister. It was inspirational to see someone who was in such a bad situation trying to make the best of it. Edit. Added link to national program I participated in to take this class since so many people were asking about it. I'm a senior officer with my department, and I can say from my perspective that this happens quite a lot. When I was a rookie I worked with an inmate who was serving life with parole for multiple sexual assault charges and escape from county jail. But I remember always thinking to myself that he seemed like a completely normal guy who hadn't let the prison politics get to him at all. He was one of my culinary workers and he would always do any job I asked of him without question or attitude. And to top it all off, he was a military veteran who would even reminisce with our sergeant, who was also a veteran, about their past deployments. It was so bizarre to see someone who could have very well been my neighbor serving such a lengthy sentence for such an awful crime. Not a CO but worked in a psych ward. In this case the guy went to prison and was eventually stepped down to our psych ward. He had stabbed his dad multiple times and killed him. He was with us for around a year, so I saw him 5-6 times a week. Anywhere from 8-14 hours each shift. He was so kind and polite. You would never think he had done anything remotely shocking. When his relationship with his dad would come up, he would talk so calmly and normally. No real hatred or anger. Yet he murdered him. If there were ever fights on the ward, he would look out for staff and other patients. I won't lie. He was a delight. TLDR. Worked with a murderer. He was one of my nicest patients. I got to play softball against the inmates at the FedMed here in town. The first time in was pretty scary, but it ended up being the best couple hours of softball I've ever played. Everyone was real nice, just joking around the whole time, just like playing with the guys. It was pretty hard to believe that they were hardened criminals when we were all out there enjoying a game together. They had guys with a PA system calling the game while we played, ribbing everyone that got within 10 feet of them. Inmates would come up to our dugout telling us they had bets on our team so we better win. Or hit it to that guy, he sucks. I do remember when I was at bat, the catcher told me to hit to the center fielder who was a pedophile. He used the prison slang for it. I can't remember. And I had no idea what he meant. In the end, everyone was super nice and fun. Again, for those few hours I forgot I was in a federal prison playing against people who did some horrible things. Edit. The guys calling the game noticed my bright red cleats and called me Dorothy for the rest of the game. So that was nice. Edit. The pedophile slang has been solved. It was chomo. Edit cubed. This is my most upvoted comment ever. Neato. Feel free to ask any questions about it. It was really quite the experience. XCO here. Had a man who shot and killed one state trooper and shot another in the groin. He sat as a sniper in the woods and shot the troopers through the windows of the barracks. It was premeditated and he nearly got away with it. He was on FBI most wanted list for a good 2 months. The marshals caught him as he was getting ready to take off on a hang glider. Anyway, he was the most mild-mannered inmate I had met. Always reading. Never turned down his hour for rec. Always finished his plate. etc. Anyway, I was doing an escort with another officer to take him to visitation. He was to wear double lock shackles and cuffs when not in his cell. Even in the showers. I was holding his arm and assisting him so he wouldn't trip, and I felt his bicep flex and he just stopped walking and looked at me. I realized at that moment that he could overpower me without much effort. Shackles or not. Turns out he just had to sneeze. My point is that whether someone is mild-mannered or more primitive has no effect on human capabilities. Cold-blooded killer. For a more accurate picture, I am a 5'8", 125 pound female. Edited to add a closing sentence. Edited again to add that I'm a female. Not a CO, but I did work in a prison. Lots of inmates were seemingly decent people. One guy in particular was a hitman. He and his story were well known at the time. When I met him, I had no idea who he was and wondered what he could have done to land in prison. When I found out who he was, I read one of the books about him. That guy was pretty brutal. My husband is a CO. The guys he talks about actually sound like good people. Then I ask what they did and it will always be a murderer or guy who spent years raping his own kids. Former inmate here. Long story short, I was sentenced to state prison for selling small amounts of marijuana, and during my time in the high security classification facility I enrolled in a Jewish study group to meet people and pass the time. One of the other regular members happened to be a former professor of economics from UPenn, specializing in game theory, who happened to be a really nice and personable guy if you could just look past the fact he was there for beating his wife to death with a crowbar over a divorce settlement. Needless to say, we made a lot of prisoner's dilemma jokes. Former CO here. One particular inmate fit this bill for me. I worked third shift on a housing unit and as such, had to oversee the floor cleaning crew, comprised of 7 or 8 inmates, one of whom was their supervisor. The supervisor was a guy I just didn't understand. He was about 50, extremely polite, worked his ass off, never got into trouble or broke the rules, always kept his guys on task. I didn't get it. I knew he had been in since he was 18 but never bothered to look up his crime until I was about to leave the job. Sure enough, it was bad. At 18 he had abducted, raped, and kept a 13-year-old girl in his parents' basements for about a week. I think it was his parents who turned him in. From my personal experience, the nicest inmates are usually the ones who have committed the worst crimes: murder, The ones that always give you problems are the guys that get arrested for minor like petty theft, cannabis, loitering. They always come in with major attitudes that never ends well. Obligatory, not a corrections officer, but I am an intake mental health therapist, and we see a large number of people who are put on probation, respecting confidentiality and all. There was one guy I remember who was in his early 50s, had done some objectively horrible things, and it all stemmed from trauma reactions. He grew up severely abused and neglected, and he wanted so much to just be able to be left alone to live life, as he knew he couldn't function in society. It was heartbreaking. Not a CO, but every person that came in contact with Edmund Kemper said he was well spoken and seemed like a gentle giant, until he started talking about his crimes. I think that's what makes him the most fearsome serial, in my opinion, because with the way he talks and seems kind at first, I probably would have been a young dumb kid that would have gotten in his car too. Not my story but my mother's. Also, she wasn't a correction officer, but apart from that, we're right on topic. She was a social worker in Gloucestershire. In the mid-1990s, she was asked by the police to attend the interviews of a suspect during pre-trial questioning to ensure the mental health of the suspect. That individual was Rose West. In her 30+ year career working with some of the most damaged people in society, the weeks she spent doing this were among the most distressing for her personally, partly because of the horrific details of what Rose and her husband, Fred, did, partly because of the utterly calm way in which Rose dismissed all the accusations made against her by the police, but not least because in between the questioning, when they took breaks, Rose was a friendly, polite, pleasant individual, nattering quietly with my mother about shopping, clothes and other random small talk. Former CO. Absolutely all the time. I usually found myself having pleasant conversations with inmates almost like they are old buddies, only to find out they are in for horrendous crimes. Had one guy who was super kind, trying to give me advice. I was a 19-year-old, fresh-faced CO, about how to manage inmates with my inferior age and size. Super kind and respectful. I looked him up on our system to see what he was in for, expecting something small, to find he was in for murder and arson in the first degree. Honestly, the both comforting and terrifying thing is majority of inmates are just like everyone else who just have made bad, some really bad, choices. TV greatly over-exaggerates criminals to be sociopaths, set in their ways, and inhumane. It puts into perspective how easily you could be on the other side of the bars. Former caseworker, state prison, CO, and jailer. Frequently the people you meet interact in a normal manner. If I didn't know what their past was, you wouldn't be able to guess. 3 are most assuredly exceptions to this. I've had inmates on my caseload that most definitely did not deserve prison. I've also had a few that I have no issue believing they have no soul. I've spent a year with a prisoner. I was fellow inmate. The sickest, most wild guy would talk to all the time, and he was friendly and nice but would turn on you in seconds if you said something wrong. Super short fuse. Screaming off the handle. You always had a sense of no soul in his eyes. Semi-relevant. My father worked in a maximum security prison for over 20 years. His friends were all inmates. He said they were nicer than most of the people who worked there. One of them, Doc, was a cool guy and knew how to tool and craft with leather. He made my family all kinds of gifts over the years, such as book covers with our name on them, a belt with Lincoln Mario for my brother, a black belt covered in flowers for me, etc. We also had paintings that prisoners had made, and my dad spent time in the ceramics room making things with prisoners. A prisoner etched on glass a cartoon of me opening a gift box and finding a kitten inside. He gave it to me, told me to be careful and that the picture would be lost if the glass broke, and I still have it. It's right next to me on my shelves. I asked my dad about Doc one day. What did he do? He found his wife in bed with another man and shot him. Why do we have so many things that prisoners like Doc made? Because everyone deserves a second chance. He denies to this day that he said such a thing. He loves to needle me about politics because we disagree, but I know deep down he's still the man who believes in second chances. I worked in a small prison in Germany. Now and then, when the other prisons in the area were over capacity, We'd get the odd weekend guest, mostly abusive spouses who were locked up for a few days so they had the chance to pack a few bags in peace to get away. Drunks who'd gone on a rampage. That kind of thing. I worked there for 8 years. And during that time there was one guy who was a recurring guest. He was in his late 50s. Always well dressed. Very friendly. Educated. Extremely compliant with our rules. Basically the kind of inmate you want if you work in a place like this. As a woman I never had much to do with him. But my colleagues always reported that the guy was almost a joy to meet and work with. He was a stalker. The object of his obsession was a young woman from his small town neighborhood. He'd relentlessly terrorize her for the better part of 10 years. Starting when she was in her late teens. Thousands of phone calls, letters, attempts to get into her parents' house apartment, not sure which it was, following her on the streets. The stalker laws, when it started, basically said that as long as he didn't do anything to her physically, there was nothing that could be done. I have no idea why the family didn't move away from that town to protect her. The times he was locked up, it was for attempts of breaking and entering. He ended up killing her. Edit. Spelling stuff. Supervisor here. I run chow each morning and a while back there was a guy who would come through the line each morning smiling and being quite friendly and personable saying good morning lieutenant. He was friendly enough that I had never bothered to look him up as far as his crime details. Much later I go to his unit to visit the officer and notice a strange open letter on the officer's desk. I ask about it and the officer tells me, oh yeah, that's from Jones. He's been trying to get back to his Caribbean country for years. Turns out the guy has dual citizenship and wants to get transferred there. He can't though because his crime was committed in our state. He had gotten in a big argument with his wife outside his house one winter night and beat her to death and then cut off her head. He then took the head and left the body on the doorstep. Even more messed up was that he left their 2-year-old with the body. Police later received a call about a crying child and found the kid holding onto his dead mother in the snow. The kid was cold but unharmed. The inmate still comes through the line just as friendly as can be. I wish him good morning in return but keep a bit closer eye on him now that I know his background. Both of my parents work at a psychiatric hospital for people who are found mentally incompetent to stand trial, or that are awaiting assessment for it. My mom never wants to know what people did, because she doesn't want it to color her opinion of them. Sometimes surreal things happen. Like a guy standing in the yard looking really hard at something just outside the fence. She asked him what he was doing and he said, look at that weird bird. Do you see that tall bird over there? It keeps looking at me. She just told him she couldn't see it but her eyesight was bad. And it was outside the fence so he was safe. He accepted that answer and wandered off. There are so many that are locked up because they have mental issues. Get arrested for walking down the street naked or something. Get institutionalized. Get medicine. Get better. Get released. Quit taking medicine. Repeat. But there are some that did really horrific things. And that will never see freedom again. Some guy murdered his mother and cut out her heart and pissed in the cavity. That's the one that really sticks out. Very nice docile dude. Gotta wonder if he just lost his mind. Or if she did something awful to him. I am not a CO. But I work in addictions recovery. You realize that everyone is fundamentally the same when you get trapped in a game of Magic the Gathering by a Latino gangbanger with teardrop tattoos. That guy could sling spells like nobody's booziness. He was also really good at killing people apparently. I interned at a mental health ward for kids. On my first day, I just played cards and basketball with all the kids to get to know them. One girl stuck out to me. She was a little kooky, but had a great sense of humor and was amazing at I described her as a budding card shark to my internship group. On my second day, I read the kids' files. Miss Card Shark was in there for killing her family's dog. I was so shaken. I considered asking to switch to a different internship, but ended up staying. MCS had actually been there for 2 years and was in the final stages of successful treatment. So for the rest of my time with her, she was just like any other kid. It was definitely weird, though, when she was playing games with other kids and would jokingly say I'll kill you. I am a CO. Twice a week I go and get an inmate to clean up officers in the facility. He has access to lots of things he could kill me with. has killed people, and as a former shot caller, has had lots of people beat down, stabbed, and some killed. I love to read, and this guy has read pretty much every book written, as he's been in seg so much that he just read all day, all the time. Since I don't share any personal details with inmates, whether they just stole a truck or killed kids or talked in theaters, real heinous it, you know, and keep my life on lockdown, books are a safe topic. He is very smart, and has a grasp of literature and its impact that is refreshing and enjoyable. I love talking with Garnell, made up name, about books while he cleans, and I make sure he doesn't get into off-limits areas or kill anyone. Former CO. But the thing that really strikes you is how normal they are. I had an inmate who was going through a rough divorce and got drunk, rode his bike up to his soon-to-be ex-wife's house and dismembered her with a kitchen knife, and then fell asleep in his old bed. He would pace in his cell all night and tell people who asked he was just reflecting on how he got there, had never been in trouble before, was very intelligent, and was always very kind and caring. I maintain that if he ever got out, he won't. I would have a coffee with him and catch up. I work in juvenile corrections. There are a lot of pretty nice kids that have done some pretty ducked up it. One in particular is a little 12-year-old that gets constantly picked on by the other inmates because he is short and he has bowel problems, so he has to wear diapers. Turns out he molested multiple little kids, would trap rats to break their spines, and had a habit of throwing cats off of tall buildings to see if they land on their feet. I was on the other side of the bars, but I'll say this. Most inmates are genuinely really nice people. When I was in jail, I met a great guy. He poured liquid Drano on his neighbors, but when he wasn't a complete psychopath, he volunteered at a soup kitchen and played piano at the community center. Super friendly, charming, funny, good cook. The guy was a model citizen, except of course for the trying to kill people with house cleaners thing. Obligatory, not a correction officer, but I had a similar job. One of the nicest, most polite, likable inmates that I worked with was serving time for assaulting an off-duty police officer. The officer was in the hospital for months and had serious brain damage to where he will never recover and live his normal life again. If I didn't know the backstory and just met this inmate on the street, I would have thought he'd be someone I'd be friends with. He was kind, calm, and funny and liked by all the staff, and never would have been pegged as someone who would commit such a crime. However, shockingly enough, he was never sorry about his actions or said he regretted what happened or anything. Maybe his likable personality was just a ruse, but it worked. There's a podcast called Ear Hustle which looks at the lives and people in a California prison. A lot of the people they interview are in prison for bad crimes, but they are still relatable characters. Def recommend listening to it. Hey, something I can answer. Nicest person I've probably ever met in my life. He was older gentleman, around 65, always was early to everything, was extremely polite, addresses the CO's professional, and always helped keep the unit in line. Turns out he was in remand because he was on trial for a triple homicide. He was a hitman for the HA and did a last hit on a competing gang as a retirement package for his family. He was the kind of guy that I would expect to be in there for tax evasion, not being a hitman. Quite honestly, most of the 6 offenders I work with are the nicest, most understanding inmates I've ever met, and that bothers the it out of me. I don't read their arrest reports anymore because the last guy who was super nice to me I found out sodomized his own son while his wife and daughter were sleeping. That was the first and last time I read and so's papers. Not a corrections officer, but I went on a trip to a prison in college in the UK a few years back. Met a bunch of inmates and sat in this room with a bunch of my classmates, with them sitting intermingled with us. We chatted with them, and there was one guy that seemed really nice and genuine. When asked why he was in there, he explained that there were a gang of guys that broke into his mate's house during a party, hit the guy's girlfriend with a hammer and robbed the people there. I could be misremembering, but I'm pretty sure that was the gist. He then said that his mate called him to go beat the it out of the guy that did it, and he agreed to help his mate out. It got out of hand. His mate killed the guy after he had conveniently left, and then he was arrested and sent to prison. We kinda sympathized with him and he seemed like a nice guy. Once we had left the prison, one of the officers explained what had really happened. Apparently it was in the local news when it had happened. Turns out him and his mate had gone to the guy's house. beast the it out of him and then used hammers to ducking mince his body and ran over it with a car a few times. When the body was found they said it was so disfigured they didn't know where the head on it was. The idea that a guy that I'd sat next to and shaken hands with had done that was quite strange. Not me, but my dad was a CO and had someone in his building that was a respected member of a Jewish community somewhere. His daughter's boyfriend raped her and left her for dead on the side of the road. The inmate found and rescued his daughter, then went and killed the boyfriend with a shotgun. Outside of this one act that got him life in prison. The inmate was a very intelligent and nice guy. Only heard about him once. Dad didn't like to talk about work at home. Former CO. Current cop. At the prison I worked at there was an IM who had murdered his entire family. 5 people. In an LSD fueled rage. One of the nicest IMs there. And a good porter. IMs that had a job cleaning the housing unit. He knew he had a problem after he was incarcerated and I believe he even let a psychologist come and interview him. I never had an issue with him. I am currently a psych RN and previously worked in a couple of prisons. The nature of being a sociopath is that they have really good social skills. They are charming, even, but they have no sense guilt, no conscience that might keep them from harming others. We were warned during our orientation that over 50% of prisoners are sociopaths. Not me, but my sibling is a sheriff in a Canadian province. Sheriffs in Canada handle courtroom security and transportation of prisoners. She had one person in custody who was on trial after getting caught for murdering multiple women. He was in his early 20s and her exact words were, "Thank goodness he got caught because if I didn't know better I definitely would have been friends with the guy." Nurse here. Did my capstone in school at the prison. One guy comes to mind. Came up to ask a question about his medication. Was super polite and nice and even cracked a funny joke. After he left, the nurse I was shadowing told me he kidnapped a 12-year-old girl, raped her, then set her on fire and burnt her alive. Ducking nope. My dad is currently an investigator in a prison and licensed to perform polygraphs. Before working in the prison, one of the jobs he had was to interview candidates who applied to work for the state patrol. While performing a polygraph, they had to pass the polygraph in order to go on to the state patrol academy. He's really good at what he does and very personable. Eventually he ended up getting burnt out emotionally from it and took a different job. Some of these applicants who looked really good on paper and on the surface level would end up confessing to him that they had done some really awful things in their past. Some of the worst ones that come to mind, that he's told me about, anyway, are having sex with the family dog or farm animal or messing around sexually with a sibling. The absolute worst one that my dad had a hard time with, I'm even struggling to type this, is when this guy told him about first molesting and eventually progressing to raping his girlfriend's 1-year-old daughter. They obviously ended up arresting this guy and had to bring the girlfriend in to inform her of this. Just awful. It's crazy to think that if they hadn't done the polygraph interviews on these people, that they would never come to find out those things and might have actually become state troopers. It's chilling. Really.